1. The Ghosts of Yorktown Memorial Hospital. Yorktown Memorial Hospital sits eerily quiet now, its long-abandoned walls hiding the echoes of untold horrors. It was built in 1950 by the Felician Sisters and operated as a Catholic-run facility. For years, the hospital served the rural community of Yorktown, tending to everything from childbirths to surgeries. However, its halls were no strangers to tragedy. Malpractice suits, rumors of botched operations, and whispered tales of patients left to die filled the community. It wasn't long before the hospital's reputation shifted from one of healing to one of horror. In the early 1980s, the hospital was shut down. The reasons for the closure remain vague to this day. Some blame financial difficulties, while others insist the hospital's dark history of mysterious patient deaths had caught up to it. The building was left to rot, its windows boarded, its hallways silent. That is, until the dead began to speak. Paranormal investigators began to take interest in the site shortly after its abandonment. The locals swore it was haunted. Some claimed to see lights flickering from the inside at night. Others heard strange groans and moans carried by the wind. The first group of investigators ventured into the hospital's decaying interior armed with nothing but flashlights, cameras, and recorders. What they captured inside would chill even the most hardened skeptic. As they ventured deeper into the hospital, the temperature dropped suddenly. A heavy, oppressive air seemed to settle on them. At first, it was just whispers, inaudible murmurs carried on the wind, but as they ventured deeper into the surgical ward, the whispers turned into distinct voices. The investigators heard someone, or something, screaming in agony from a room just ahead. When they rushed toward the source, they found nothing but an empty room stained with age and rot. But that wasn't the worst of it. One of the investigators, a man named Greg, claimed to feel a hand grab his wrist. Thinking it was one of his colleagues, he turned around only to find no one there. He looked down, and his skin had turned icy cold, with deep, angry red scratches clawed across his forearm. The most infamous spirit haunting Yorktown is said to be that of a former nun. Known to many as the Nurse in White, she had been a head nurse during the hospital's more active years, dedicated to her faith and her patients. But one fateful day, she made a grave mistake during surgery, one that cost a patient their life. Distraught with guilt, she took her own life in the surgical ward. Since that day, visitors have reported seeing her ghostly figure wandering through the halls, searching endlessly for the patient she failed to save. Her presence is often accompanied by the sound of clinking medical instruments, like scalpels being laid out on a tray, and the faint, unmistakable scent of antiseptic. No one enters the hospital now without hearing the stories of those who have come before. Some feel hands on their shoulders or see shadowy figures moving in the corners of their vision. Others hear voices, calling their names from the empty, decaying rooms. But the worst fate seems to be reserved for those who attempt to stay the night. One group of daring explorers decided to test their luck. Armed with cameras, recorders, and a thirst for the paranormal, they entered Yorktown Memorial Hospital under the cover of darkness. Hours passed without much incident until midnight. At exactly 12:00 a.m., the building came to life. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled violently, and a cold wind seemed to sweep through the halls, despite the stagnant air outside. Their equipment started to malfunction, batteries drained instantly, recorders picked up static, and the camera caught fleeting glimpses of figures that weren't there a second before. One by one, the explorers began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just fear, it was as though something was watching them, stalking them from the shadows. In their panic, they ran for the exit, but the door they had entered through wouldn't budge. It was as if the hospital had decided to keep them. Suddenly, one of the group members, Sarah, screamed. She had felt something cold brush against her neck, like icy fingers grazing her skin. When they shone the flashlight on her, they saw what looked like handprints forming on her throat, finger by finger, as though an invisible force was tightening its grip. They fled in terror, and when they finally managed to force the door open, they never looked back. Sarah was taken to the hospital later that night, and though the handprints faded, the trauma did not. She hasn't spoken a word since. The abandoned hospital stands as a decaying monument to the dead, and those who venture inside often find themselves trapped, not by locked doors, but by the unrelenting gaze of something they cannot see. Some never truly leave, their minds haunted long after they've escaped Yorktown's haunted halls. 2. The Black-Eyed Children of Abilene. It was a warm night in Abilene, Texas, when Brian Bethel sat in his parked car, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The year was 1996, and he had stopped near a movie theater to write out a check. The glow from the street lamps gave the night an almost surreal quality, casting everything in a muted golden hue. As Bethel focused on his checkbook, a knock came at the driver's side window. Startled, Bethel looked up and saw two young boys standing outside. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. Both were dressed in what appeared to be outdated clothing, simple, plain, and slightly worn. The boys stood still, unnaturally calm, staring down at the ground. The taller of the two boys spoke first. His voice was soft, almost too soft, and there was no trace of emotion in it. "Mister, we need a ride," he said. "Could you take us home to get some money for the movie?" Bethel's stomach twisted in knots, though he couldn't explain why. There was nothing particularly threatening about these children, and yet an overwhelming sense of dread crept over him, like a thick fog settling over the land. Something was wrong. He glanced around the parking lot. It was eerily deserted. The theater wasn't far from closing, and no one else seemed to be nearby. When he looked back at the boys, they were still standing there, unmoving, their heads still slightly bowed, as if unwilling to meet his gaze. I don't know," Bethel stammered. His voice seemed to tremble in the night air, and he felt an odd compulsion to unlock the door and let the boys in. But something inside him screamed not to. The tension in his chest grew, like a rubber band being pulled taut, threatening to snap at any second. "We can't go into the theater," the second boy said, his voice equally flat and emotionless. "We need a ride." Bethel, heart racing, found himself inching his hand toward the door lock, though every fiber of his being screamed to stop. But then the taller boy lifted his head, and Bethel's heart nearly stopped in his chest. The boy's eyes were black. Not just dark, but completely black, with no whites, no pupils, just deep, empty voids, like bottomless pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Terror flooded Bethel's veins, and his hand shut back from the door as if it had been burned. The boys stood there, watching him, their black eyes reflecting nothing but cold, dark emptiness. "Let us in," the taller boy said again, but this time there was something more behind his words. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Bethel fumbled with his keys, desperate to start the engine. The air inside the car felt thick, like it was suffocating him. The boys knocked again, harder this time, and Bethel swore he saw their mouths curve into small, unnatural smiles. The edges of their lips twitched upward, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was something far more sinister. Panicked, Bethel turned the ignition and the car roared to life. He looked up just as the boys took a step closer, their black eyes still fixed on him, unblinking, unnerving. "We need to get in," the taller boy said again, his voice now low and menacing. But Bethel didn't wait to hear more. He slammed his foot on the gas and sped off into the night, the boys disappearing from his rearview mirror almost instantly. When he finally reached his destination, Bethel's hands were shaking. He glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see the boys standing behind him, but they were gone. In the days that followed, Bethel couldn't shake the encounter. Something about those boys wasn't right, something far beyond the normal realm of explanation. Later, he discovered that he wasn't the only one who had encountered these strange children. Others had reported seeing them too, often late at night, usually asking for a ride or to be let inside. And they all shared one terrifying detail, those black, soulless eyes. Bethel never returned to that parking lot, and the encounter remains one of the most chilling experiences of his life. To this day, no one knows what the black-eyed children really are, whether they are spirits, demons, or something far worse. But those who encounter them know one thing for sure: they are not human. 3. The Phantom Light of Saratoga, deep in the Penny Woods of East Texas, along an old stretch of railroad track near the ghost town of Bragg, lies a mystery that has baffled locals for decades: the Phantom Light of Saratoga. This eerie, glowing orb appears at random intervals, floating along the deserted tracks late at night, casting a strange, otherworldly light on the surrounding forest. The light has been reported as far back as the late 1800s, when workers on the Saratoga and Sabine Pass Railroad first spotted it. The stories that followed were wild and varied. Some believed it was the ghost of a railroad worker who had been decapitated in a tragic accident, his lantern swinging in the night as he searched for his lost head. Others whispered that it was the spirit of an old Civil War soldier still patrolling the tracks, forever bound to the land where he died. Despite the legends, no one has been able to explain the source of the light. Skeptics claim it's just swamp gas or headlights from distant vehicles, but those who have seen it up close swear it's something far stranger. One such encounter occurred in the 1970s when a group of high school friends decided to camp out near the old tracks, determined to catch a glimpse of the legendary light. Armed with flashlights and an old camera, they set up camp, their excitement mounting as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in darkness. For hours they waited, the silence of the woods pressing in on them like a heavy blanket. Just as they were about to give up, a faint glow appeared in the distance, hovering above the tracks. At first, it was just a small, flickering light, but as it drew closer, it grew brighter, more intense, until it was an orb of blinding white light. The group stared in awe, their hearts pounding in their chests. The light seemed to move with purpose, gliding silently along the tracks. One of the boys, braver than the rest, grabbed his flashlight and started walking toward it, calling out to the others to follow. But as he approached, the light suddenly changed. Its glow turned from white to a sickly, pulsing red. A wave of terror washed over them, and the boy froze in his tracks. The light flared brighter for a moment, and then, without warning, it rushed toward him. In a blind panic, he turned and ran back to the group, the red light hot on his heels. The others screamed and bolted for the car, not stopping until they were miles away from the tracks. When they'd finally stopped to catch their breath, the boy who had approached the light was shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't explain what had happened, but one thing was clear: the phantom light of Saratoga was no mere illusion. In the years since, countless others have reported seeing the light. Some describe it as a friendly, guiding glow, others as an ominous, threatening force. But one thing remains consistent: the light always appears along the same stretch of railroad tracks, its origins a mystery lost to time. 4. The Donner Party of Texas. In the mid-1800s, a group of pioneers set out to explore the vast Texas wilderness. They were led by John and Mary Donner, a brother and sister duo with grand visions of establishing a settlement near what is now Austin. Their party consisted of about 20 settlers, all eager for a fresh start in the new land. But the journey was fraught with challenges from the start. The unforgiving Texas landscape, with its sweltering heat and harsh terrain, quickly wore them down. Supplies ran low, tempers flared, and the group found themselves lost in the wilderness. As the days stretched on and the food supplies dwindled, desperation set in. It was then that the unthinkable happened. According to the survivors' accounts, John Donner became increasingly unstable as the days passed. His behavior grew erratic, and he began to speak of visions, dark, terrible visions of blood and death. The group pressed on, hoping to find water or some sign of civilization, but all they found was more endless wilderness. One night, as the group huddled around a small fire, John Donner snapped. He lunged at one of the settlers, attacking him with a wild, crazed fury. The others tried to intervene, but Donner was too strong. He killed the man and fled into the night, leaving the group in shock and horror. The next morning, they found Donner's sister, Mary, wandering the woods in a daze, covered in blood. She claimed that her brother had spoken to her in the night, urging her to join him in the darkness to embrace the hunger that gnawed at their souls. What happened next is a matter of legend. Some say that Mary led the group to her brother's camp, where they found him feasting on the body of the man he had killed. Others claim that Mary herself succumbed to the madness, turning on her fellow settlers in a frenzy of bloodlust. Whatever the truth, only a handful of survivors emerged from the wilderness, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. The settlers' remains were never found, and the area where the Donner Party disappeared became known as the Cursed Woods among the locals. Even today, hikers and campers in the area report strange occurrences, whispers in the wind, shadowy figures moving through the trees, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some say that the ghosts of the Donner Party still roam the woods, their souls forever trapped in the wilderness that claimed their lives. 5. The Woman in the Weeping Trees. In the small town of Talengua, near the border of Mexico, There's an old cemetery nestled among the hills. The cemetery is mostly forgotten now, overgrown with weeds and brush, but for years it was the resting place for the town's miners and their families. One grave, in particular, has become the source of local legend. It belongs to a woman named Maria, who died under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. Some say she was a victim of a mining accident, while others believe she was murdered by her husband in a fit of jealous rage. Whatever the cause, Maria was buried in the old cemetery, her grave marked by a simple headstone and 2 weeping willow trees that were planted in her honor. But soon after her death, strange things began to happen. Late at night, locals reported hearing the sound of a woman crying near the cemetery. The cries were soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder and more desperate as the night wore on. Some claimed they saw a figure, a woman dressed in white, standing beneath the weeping willows, her face hidden behind a veil of long, dark hair. Over the years, the legend of the woman in the weeping trees grew. It was said that Maria's spirit was trapped in the cemetery, bound to the trees that had been planted on her grave. The cries of her ghost could be heard on the wind, and those who dared to enter the cemetery at night often found themselves overcome with a deep, overwhelming sadness. One such story comes from a group of teenagers who decided to test the legend for themselves. They snuck into the cemetery one warm summer night, armed with flashlights and bravado. As they wandered among the gravestones, they began to hear the faint sound of sobbing. At first, they laughed it off, thinking it was just the wind. But as they approached the 2 weeping willows at the far end of the cemetery, the sobbing grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, one of the girls screamed. She pointed toward the trees, where a figure was standing, a woman in a long, white dress, her face obscured by her dark hair. The air around them grew cold, and the sobbing turned into wails of anguish. The teens bolted from the cemetery, not stopping until they were safely back in town. They later discovered that one of the boys had left his flashlight behind near the trees. When he returned the next morning to retrieve it, he found it lying on the ground, its glass shattered. But that wasn't the worst part. The weeping willows were covered in deep, scratch-like marks, as if something had clawed at the trees in a fit of rage. To this day, locals avoid the cemetery after dark. They say that Maria's spirit still lingers beneath the weeping willows, forever mourning her tragic fate, her cries carried on the wind for all eternity. 6. The Cursed Bell of Presidio Chapel. In the dusty border town of Presidio, Texas, there stands an ancient chapel, its adobed walls worn by time and the relentless desert sun. The Presidio Chapel, as it's known, has been a place of worship for centuries, but its most famous feature is not the building itself, it's the massive bronze bell that hangs in the bell tower. The bell, cast in Spain in the early 1700s, was brought to Presidio by a group of Franciscan missionaries. It was said to be blessed, its tolls meant to protect the town from evil and misfortune. But as the years went on, the bell's reputation darkened. People began to notice that whenever the bell was rung, something terrible would happen shortly afterward. Accidents, deaths, mysterious illnesses. It seemed that the bell had become cursed. The most famous incident occurred in the late 1800s when a priest named Father Miguel rang the bell to signal the start of Mass. Within minutes, a powerful storm swept through the town, destroying homes and killing several people. The townsfolk were convinced that the bell had summoned the storm, and from that day on, no one dared to ring it again. For decades, the bell remained silent, gathering dust in the tower. But the curse was far from over. In the 1930s, a group of bandits broke into the chapel, hoping to steal the valuable artifacts inside. As they ransacked the building, one of them decided to ring the bell, perhaps out of curiosity or mockery. The moment the bell tolled, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. A violent earthquake struck the town, toppling buildings and sending the bandits fleeing in terror. The town was devastated, and the bell was once again blamed for the disaster. It was said that the spirits of those who had died in the earthquake now haunted the chapel, their voices carried on the wind whenever the bell was touched. In the years since, the bell has remained untouched, its curse a grim reminder of the town's tragic past. But some say that on certain nights, when the wind is just right, you can hear the faint sound of the bell tolling in the distance, warning of the horrors to come. 7. The Goatman's Bridge of Denton. Near the city of Denton, Texas, there is an old iron bridge that stretches across Hickory Creek, known to locals as the Goatman's Bridge. The bridge, officially called Old Alton Bridge, was built in the late 1800s to connect the small towns of Alton and Denton. But it's not the history of the bridge that draws people, it's the legend of the Goatman. The story goes that in the early 1900s, a black goat farmer named Oscar Washburn was living near the bridge. He was known to the locals as a kind and hard-working man, and his farm prospered. But his success drew the ire of a group of white supremacists who resented his success. One night, they stormed Washburn's farm, dragging him to the bridge where they hung him from the rafters. But when they looked down to confirm his death, Washburn's body had vanished, leaving nothing but the noose swinging in the wind. Furious and terrified, the men searched the area, but Washburn was never found. From that night on, strange things began to happen near the bridge. Travelers reported seeing a figure with the body of a man and the head of a goat wandering the area, his eyes glowing red in the darkness. Some claimed to hear his voice calling out to them, luring them toward the edge of the bridge. Those who were brave enough, or foolish enough, to answer his call were never seen again. The legend of the Goatman spread, and the bridge became a hotspot for thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators. But those who venture there after dark often regret it. Visitors report hearing strange footsteps behind them, feeling an unseen force pushing them toward the edge, and seeing glowing red eyes watching them from the shadows. One story tells of a group of teenagers who decided to test the legend one Halloween night. They stood on the bridge, daring each other to call out to the Goatman. As they laughed and taunted the spirit, the temperature suddenly dropped, and the air grew thick with the smell of sulfur. One by one, the teens felt a cold hand on their shoulders, and the sound of heavy breathing surrounded them. In a panic, they ran for their car, but as they reached the end of the bridge, they saw a figure standing in their path, a tall, shadowy man with the head of a goat. His glowing red eyes bored into them as they screamed and fled into the woods. To this day, the Goatman's Bridge remains one of Texas's most infamous haunted locations. Those who visit it are warned to be cautious, for the Goatman still roams the area, waiting for his next victim. 8. The Woman in Black of San Antonio. In the historic district of San Antonio, Texas, there is an old Victorian mansion that has stood for over a century. It's a beautiful, stately home, but it hides a dark secret, a secret that has given rise to one of San Antonio's most enduring ghost stories. The mansion was once owned by a wealthy family, the Johnsons, who were known for their lavish parties and extravagant lifestyle. But tragedy struck when the family's daughter, Emily, fell ill with a mysterious disease. Despite the best efforts of doctors, Emily's condition worsened, and she eventually succumbed to the illness. In her grief, Emily's mother, Eleanor, retreated into herself, dressing in black mourning clothes and rarely leaving the house. She became obsessed with the idea of communicating with her dead daughter, holding seances and consulting with spiritualists in an attempt to make contact with Emily's spirit. As the years passed, Eleanor grew more and more unhinged. She would wander the halls of the mansion at night, calling out to her daughter, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. Servants reported seeing her standing by Emily's old bedroom, speaking to someone who wasn't there. One stormy night, Eleanor was found dead in the mansion's grand parlor, her body draped in black. The cause of death was never determined, but some believe that she died of a broken heart, still longing to be reunited with her daughter. In the years since, the mansion has changed hands many times, but the spirit of Eleanor Johnson has never left. Visitors often report seeing a woman in black wandering the halls, her face hidden beneath a veil. She is usually spotted near Emily's old bedroom or in the grand parlor where she died. Some have even claimed to hear her voice, softly calling out to her lost daughter. The mansion is now a museum, but the staff and visitors still experience strange occurrences. Doors open and close on their own, cold spots appear out of nowhere, and the sound of footsteps can be heard echoing through the empty halls. Those who encounter the woman in black describe an overwhelming sense of sadness and loss, as if they are feeling Eleanor's eternal grief. One chilling account comes from a tour guide who was leading a group through the mansion late one evening. As they reached the grand parlor, the guide noticed a woman standing in the corner, dressed in black. Thinking it was a guest who had wandered off, she called out to her, but the woman didn't respond. When the guide approached, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving behind a cold gust of wind. To this day, the woman in black remains one of San Antonio's most famous ghostly residents, forever mourning the loss of her beloved daughter. 9. The mysterious lights of Marfa. In the desolate expanse of West Texas, just outside the small town of Marfa, strange lights have been appearing in the sky for over a century. Known as the Marfa lights, these mysterious orbs of light have baffled locals and visitors alike, defying explanation and leaving scientists scratching their heads. The lights, which appear on the horizon near the Chinati Mountains, are usually seen on clear nights. They vary in size and color, sometimes appearing as small flickering orbs and other times as large glowing balls of light. The lights move erratically, darting across the sky, disappearing and reappearing without warning. The first recorded sighting of the Marfa lights dates back to 1883, when a cowboy named Robert Ellison spotted them while herding cattle. He initially thought they were campfires from Apache tribes in the distance, but when he rode closer, he found no trace of any fire or people. The lights continued to appear, and soon, the locals began to take notice. Over the years, countless theories have been proposed to explain the phenomenon. Some believe the lights are the result of car headlights or atmospheric conditions, while others insist they are supernatural in nature, ghostly spirits, or even UFOs. One of the most famous sightings occurred in the 1950s when a group of soldiers stationed at a nearby base reported seeing the lights while on a training exercise. The soldiers described the lights as bright orbs that hovered in the sky before shooting off at incredible speeds. Despite their best efforts to track the lights, they couldn't explain what they had seen. In the decades since, the Marfa lights have continued to draw visitors from all over the world. Some come with cameras and scientific equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the lights, while others come simply to witness the eerie beauty of the unexplained phenomenon. One chilling account comes from a couple who decided to camp near the viewing area to get a closer look at the lights. They set up their tent and settled in for the night, keeping a close eye on the horizon. Just after midnight, the lights appeared, glowing orbs that danced across the sky, flickering in and out of existence. The couple watched in awe, but as the lights grew brighter, something strange happened. The air around them seemed to grow thick, and they both felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The lights, which had been distant, suddenly seemed to be moving closer, too close. Panic set in as they realized the orbs were now hovering just above the ground, moving toward their campsite. Terrified, the couple fled in their car, leaving their tent and belongings behind. When they returned the next morning, they found their tent completely undisturbed, but the ground around it was covered in strange circular burn marks, as if the lights had touched down during the night. To this day, the Marfa lights remain one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of Texas, defying explanation and leaving those who witnessed them with more questions than answers. 10. The Chupacabra of South Texas. In the remote ranchlands of South Texas, a creature stalks the night, leaving a trail of dead livestock in its wake. Known as the Chupacabra, this legendary beast is said to be responsible for the mysterious deaths of countless animals, mainly goats and cattle, whose bodies are found drained of blood, their flesh untouched. The legend of the Chupacabra first gained widespread attention in the 1990s, but sightings of the creature date back much further. Descriptions of the Chupacabra vary, but most agree that it is a small, dog-like creature with reptilian skin, sharp fangs, and glowing red eyes. It is said to attack under the cover of darkness, sucking the blood of its prey and leaving no other trace of its presence. One of the earliest recorded sightings occurred in 1975, when a rancher in the small town of Rio Grande City found several of his goats dead in the field, their bodies completely drained of blood. At first, he thought it was the work of wild dogs, but there were no signs of struggle, no bite marks on the animals, just 2 small puncture wounds on their necks. The rancher wasn't the only one to experience such a phenomenon. Over the years, more and more farmers reported similar incidents, leading to widespread fear and speculation about what was responsible. Some believed it was a new species of predator, while others insisted it was the work of a supernatural creature. The legend of the Chupacabra exploded in the 1990s after a series of livestock deaths in Puerto Rico were attributed to the creature. Reports of similar attacks soon spread across the Americas, with numerous sightings in Texas. One chilling encounter comes from a farmer near Laredo, Texas, who claimed to have come face to face with the chupacabra one fateful night. The farmer, named Manuel, was awoken by the sound of his goats bleating in terror. Grabbing his rifle, he rushed outside to investigate. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Standing in the moonlight, hunched over the body of one of his goats, was a creature unlike anything Manuel had ever seen. It was small, about the size of a dog, but its skin was rough and scaly, and its eyes glowed a bright, unnatural red. The creature had long, sharp fangs, which were buried deep in the goat's neck. Manuel raised his rifle and fired, but the creature darted into the brush, disappearing into the night. When Manuel approached the goat, he found it dead, its body completely drained of blood. Shaken, he told his neighbors about the encounter, and soon, word spread that the chupacabra had returned. In the years since, sightings of the chupacabra have continued to be reported across South Texas, though the creature itself remains elusive. Some believe it's a cryptid, a previously undiscovered species, while others think it's a creature from beyond this world. Whatever the case, the chupacabra has earned its place as one of Texas's most enduring and terrifying legends. 11. The Ghost Train of Jefferson. In the quaint town of Jefferson, Texas, a ghostly train is said to haunt the old railroad tracks that run through the town. The ghost train, as it's known, has been a part of local legend for over a century, with countless witnesses claiming to have seen or heard the spectral locomotive speeding through the night. The legend of the ghost train dates back to the late 1800s, when Jefferson was a bustling river port and railroad hub. One night, a passenger train bound for Shreveport derailed just outside of town, killing dozens of passengers and crew. The cause of the derailment was never determined, but locals speculated that the train had been sabotaged by a disgruntled employee who had recently been fired. In the years following the tragedy, strange things began to happen near the site of the derailment. Residents reported hearing the sound of a train whistle late at night, followed by the rumble of wheels on the tracks, but when they looked, there was no train in sight. Some claimed to see the ghostly outline of a steam engine speeding down the tracks, its lights glowing eerily in the darkness. One of the most famous sightings occurred in the 1940s, when a group of railroad workers were repairing a section of track near the site of the derailment. As they worked, they heard the distant sound of a train approaching. At first, they thought nothing of it, but as the sound grew louder, they realized something was off. The train seemed to be moving too fast, and there was no scheduled train due at that time. The workers stepped back from the tracks, expecting to see the train barrel past them, but instead they saw nothing. The sound of the train roared past them, shaking the ground beneath their feet, but the tracks remained empty. Shaken, the workers packed up their tools and left the site, convinced that they had encountered the ghost train of Jefferson. In the decades since, the ghost train has continued to be spotted by residents and visitors alike. Some say they've seen the glowing lights of the train speeding through the night, while others have heard the eerie whistle echoing through the town. One particularly chilling account comes from a group of teenagers who were camping near the old tracks one summer night. They had heard the stories of the ghost train and decided to test their luck, setting up camp close to the site of the derailment. Late that night, as they sat around the campfire, they heard the distant sound of a train whistle. At first, they laughed it off, thinking it was just a regular train passing through. But as the sound grew louder, they realized something was wrong. The train seemed to be heading straight for them. Panicked, they scrambled to their feet and looked toward the tracks. In the distance, they saw the faint outline of a train, its lights glowing in the darkness. But as it drew closer, the train seemed to fade in and out of existence, its whistle growing louder and louder. Just as the train seemed to be upon them, it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the sound of the whistle echoing in the night. The teenagers packed up their camp and fled, leaving behind their gear in their haste to escape. To this day, they swear they saw the ghost train of Jefferson, and they haven't returned to the track since. 12. The Devil's Backbone of Central Texas. In the rugged hills of Central Texas, there is a stretch of land known as the Devil's Backbone, a narrow limestone ridge that runs through the hill country. The area is known for its breathtaking views and rugged beauty, but it is also said to be one of the most haunted places in Texas. The Devil's Backbone has a long and bloody history. It was once home to Native American tribes who considered the area sacred. But when Spanish settlers arrived in the 1700s, they clashed with the native inhabitants, leading to a series of brutal battles. The land was soaked in blood, and many believe that the spirits of those who died in these conflicts still linger in the area. One of the most famous ghost stories associated with the Devil's Backbone is that of a Spanish conquistador who was killed by Native American warriors. According to legend, the conquistador's spirit can still be seen riding his horse along the ridge, his armor clanking as he searches for the men who killed him. Another story tells of a Confederate soldier who was killed in a skirmish during the Civil War. His ghost is said to haunt the area, appearing as a shadowy figure in a tattered uniform. Hikers and campers have reported hearing the sound of footsteps behind them, only to turn around and find no one there. But perhaps the most terrifying tale comes from a rancher who lived in the area in the early 1900s. The rancher, named Tom, had always been a skeptic when it came to ghost stories, but that changed one fateful night. Tom was out checking on his cattle late one evening when he saw a group of men on horseback riding toward him. At first, he thought they were just other ranchers, but as they drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The men were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces gaunt and pale. Before Tom could react, the men rode past him, their horses' hooves making no sound on the rocky ground. As they disappeared into the darkness, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He raced back to his house, convinced that he had just seen a group of ghostly riders. In the years since, many others have reported similar sightings: phantom riders, shadowy figures, and strange lights flickering in the distance. Some believe that the spirits of those who died in the battles for the land are still trapped there, unable to move on. The Devil's Backbone remains a popular destination for hikers and nature lovers, but those who venture into the area after dark are often warned to be cautious. The land is old, and its ghosts are restless. 13. The Haunted Hotel Galvez of Galveston. The Hotel Galvez, a grand and elegant hotel in Galveston, Texas, has stood for over a century. Built in 1911, the hotel has hosted countless guests, from wealthy tourists to celebrities. But beneath its luxurious facade lies a dark history, one that has given rise to numerous ghost stories. One of the most famous tales associated with the Hotel Galvez is that of the Lovelorn Lady, a woman who tragically took her own life in the hotel after believing her fiancé had died at sea. The woman, whose name has been lost to history, had been staying at the hotel while waiting for her fiancé's ship to return from a voyage. Days turned into weeks, and when she heard no word from him, she assumed the worst. Devastated, she hanged herself in her hotel room, unable to bear the thought of living without him. But the story doesn't end there. A few days after her death, her fiancé's ship arrived safely in port. He had been delayed due to bad weather, unaware that his fiancée had been waiting for him. When he learned of her death, he was heartbroken, and the tragedy became one of the most infamous stories in Galveston's history. Since then, guests and staff at the Hotel Galvez have reported seeing the spirit of the Lovelorn Lady wandering the halls, dressed in a long white gown. She is usually spotted near the room where she took her own life, and some guests have reported hearing her sobbing in the night. One particularly chilling account comes from a hotel guest who was staying in the room next to the one where the woman had died. In the middle of the night, the guest was awoken by the sound of knocking on the wall. At first, she thought it was just the pipes, but as the knocking grew louder, she realized it was coming from the adjoining room. Curious, she got out of bed and knocked on the wall in response. To her surprise, the knocking stopped, only to start again a few seconds later, this time more insistent. The guest, now thoroughly spooked, called the front desk to ask if anyone was staying in the room next door. The answer sent a chill down her spine. The room was empty. The staff at the Hotel Galvez are no strangers to these kinds of encounters. Many of them have their own stories of ghostly sightings, from objects moving on their own to disembodied voices echoing through the halls. Despite its haunted reputation, the Hotel Galvez remains a popular destination for tourists, many of whom come hoping to experience a brush with the paranormal. But those who do are often left with more questions than answers. 14. The Demon of El Paso High School. El Paso High School, with its grand architecture and towering columns, is one of the oldest high schools in Texas. But behind its stately appearance lies a dark and disturbing history, one that has earned it the reputation of being one of the most haunted schools in the state. The school, built in 1916, has seen its fair share of tragedy over the years. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in the 1920s when a student committed suicide by jumping from one of the school's balconies. Since then, students and faculty have reported strange occurrences throughout the building, lights flickering on and off, lockers opening and closing by themselves, and the sound of footsteps echoing through empty hallways. But the most chilling story associated with El Paso High School involves a photograph taken in the 1980s. The photo, a group picture of the school's cheerleading squad, appears normal at first glance. But upon closer inspection, there is an extra figure in the photo. Standing behind the cheerleaders is a shadowy figure that no one remembers being there. The figure appears to be that of a young woman, her face blurred and distorted. Some believe it is the spirit of the girl who committed suicide all those years ago, while others think it could be something far more sinister. One of the most disturbing reports comes from a janitor who worked at the school in the 1990s. The janitor, named Lewis, was cleaning the basement late one night when he heard a strange noise coming from one of the old classrooms. Thinking it was just a student who had stayed behind, Lewis went to investigate. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Standing in the middle of the room was a figure, a tall, shadowy being with glowing red eyes. The air around it was thick and oppressive, and Lewis felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Before he could react, the figure vanished, leaving behind a chilling silence. Lewis quit his job shortly after the encounter, convinced that the school was haunted by something far darker than a simple ghost. In the years since, students and teachers alike have reported seeing strange figures in the hallways, hearing voices when no one is around, and feeling an inexplicable sense of unease when walking through certain parts of the building. El Paso High School remains an active school, but its haunted reputation has made it a popular destination for paranormal investigators. Many who visit the school leave with the same feeling, that something evil lurks within its walls, waiting to make its presence known. 15. The Phantom Hitchhiker of Terrell. On a lonely stretch of highway outside the town of Terrell, Texas, there is a legend that has been passed down for generations. The story of the Phantom Hitchhiker. The tale dates back to the 1950s when a young woman was killed in a car accident while hitchhiking along the road. Since her death, numerous drivers have reported seeing a young woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb outstretched, hoping for a ride. She is usually described as being in her early 20s, with long dark hair and wearing a white dress. Drivers who stop to pick her up report that she gets into the car without saying a word, her face hidden by her hair. The ride is always the same. After a few miles, the woman vanishes from the car without a trace, leaving the driver confused and shaken. One of the most famous encounters occurred in the 1970s when a truck driver named Hank was traveling down the highway late one night. He spotted a young woman standing by the side of the road, her white dress glowing in the headlights. Feeling sorry for her, Hank pulled over and offered her a ride. The woman climbed into the passenger seat without speaking, her head bowed low. Hank tried to make conversation, but she didn't respond. After a few minutes, Hank glanced over at her, only to find that she had disappeared. The passenger seat was empty, and there was no sign of the woman anywhere. Shaken, Hank pulled over to the side of the road and searched the area, but the woman was gone. When he reached the nearest town, he told the locals about his encounter, and they informed him that he wasn't the first to pick up the Phantom Hitchhiker. In the years since, the story of the Phantom Hitchhiker has continued to be told, with more and more drivers reporting similar encounters. Some believe the woman's spirit is still searching for a way home, while others think she is a warning to drivers to be cautious on the dark, winding roads of Texas. 16. The Curse of the Comanche Springs. In the remote town of Fort Stockton, Texas, there lies an ancient spring known as the Comanche Springs. The springs, once a vital water source for Native American tribes and settlers alike, have long been associated with legends of curses and dark magic. According to local law, the springs were cursed by a Comanche shaman after a brutal massacre in the early 1800s. The shaman, enraged by the slaughter of his people by settlers, placed a curse on the springs, vowing that anyone who drank from the water would be doomed to a life of misfortune and misery. Over the years, the curse seemed to hold true. Settlers who relied on the springs for water often experienced strange and tragic events, crops failed, livestock died, and families were plagued by illness and death. Some claimed to see ghostly figures near the springs at night, while others heard the sound of drums and chanting carried on the wind. One of the most famous stories associated with the curse involves a man named Jacob who arrived in Fort Stockton in the 1870s. Jacob, a farmer, had heard about the fertile land near the springs and decided to settle there with his family. Despite warnings from the locals about the curse, Jacob was determined to make a life for himself. At first, everything seemed to go well. The land was fertile and Jacob's crops flourished. But soon strange things began to happen. His livestock started dying without explanation, and his children fell ill with a mysterious sickness. Desperate, Jacob sought the help of a local healer, but nothing seemed to work. One night, Jacob was awoken by the sound of drums in the distance. He stepped outside to investigate and saw a figure standing near the springs, a tall man dressed in traditional Comanche clothing, his face hidden in shadow. The figure raised his hand, and Jacob felt a cold wind rush through him, filling him with a sense of dread. The next morning, Jacob's wife was found dead in her bed, her body cold and lifeless. Convinced that the curse had claimed her, Jacob packed up his remaining belongings and fled the area, never to return. In the years since, the curse of the Comanche Springs has continued to haunt the town of Fort Stockton. The springs, once a source of life, are now seen as a place of death and darkness, and those who venture too close often find themselves plagued by misfortune. 17. The Headless Horseman of the Rio Grande. Along the banks of the Rio Grande River, near the border between Texas and Mexico, there is a legend that has been told for generations, the tale of the Headless Horseman. The story dates back to the days of the Spanish conquistadors when a ruthless soldier was beheaded in battle by Native American warriors. According to the legend, the soldier's spirit did not rest after his death. Instead, he mounted his horse and rode along the river, searching for his lost head. The Headless Horseman is said to appear on nights when the moon is full, his ghostly figure silhouetted against the sky as he rides along the riverbank. Those who encounter the Headless Horseman are said to be cursed, doomed to a life of bad luck and misfortune. Some claim to have seen him galloping through the desert, his horse's hooves leaving no trace on the ground, while others hear the sound of his ghostly laughter echoing through the night. One chilling account comes from a group of ranchers who were camping near the river in the early 1900s. As they sat around the campfire, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. At first, they thought it was just a stray horse, but as the sound grew louder, they realized something was wrong. The horse that appeared before them was not ordinary. It was a massive, spectral beast, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. On its back rode a figure dressed in armor, but his head was missing, replaced by a swirling mass of smoke and shadow. The ranchers fled in terror, but one of them, a man named Carlos, was not fast enough. He was thrown from his horse and trampled by the ghostly rider. Carlos survived the encounter, but he was never the same. He claimed to hear the sound of hoofbeats following him wherever he went, and he died a few years later under mysterious circumstances. The legend of the Headless Horseman has persisted for centuries, and those who live along the Rio Grande River still tell stories of the ghostly rider who haunts the night, forever searching for his lost head. 18. The Witch of Wimberley. In the small town of Wimberley, Texas, there is a legend of a witch who lived deep in the woods, her cabin hidden from view by the thick trees and underbrush. The witch, known as La Bruja, was said to be a powerful sorceress who could summon storms, curse crops, and even raise the dead. The legend of La Bruja dates back to the 1800s when settlers first arrived in the area. According to the story, the witch lived alone in the woods, rarely venturing into town. The locals feared her, believing that she had made a pact with the devil and that her powers came from dark magic. One of the most famous stories associated with La Bruja involves a group of men who decided to confront her after a series of strange occurrences in the town. Livestock had been disappearing, crops were failing, and a sense of unease had settled over the area. The men believed that the witch was responsible, and they set out to find her. After several days of searching, they stumbled upon her cabin deep in the woods. The air around the cabin was thick and oppressive, and the men felt an overwhelming sense of dread. But they pressed on, determined to put an end to the witch's reign of terror. When they entered the cabin, they found it empty, except for a strange, glowing book on the table. As one of the men reached out to touch the book, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room grew cold. The men heard a voice, low and guttural, whispering in a language they didn't understand. Suddenly, the book burst into flames, and the cabin was filled with a blinding light. The men fled, but only one of them made it back to town. The survivor, a man named Sam, was found wandering the streets, babbling incoherently about demons and fire. He never recovered from the encounter and died a few months later under mysterious circumstances. In the years since, the legend of La Bruja has continued to haunt the town of Wimberley. Some say that her spirit still roams the woods, seeking revenge on those who dared to disturb her. Others believe that she never truly died, and that she still practices her dark magic in secret, cursing anyone who crosses her path. 19. The Haunted Tracks of San Antonio. In the city of San Antonio, there is a railroad crossing that has become the center of one of Texas's most famous ghost stories. Known as the Haunted Tracks, the crossing is said to be the site of a tragic accident that took the lives of several children in the early 1900s. According to the legend, a school bus was driving across the tracks when it stalled. Before the driver could get the bus moving again, a train came barreling down the tracks, crashing into the bus and killing everyone on board. In the years since the accident, strange things have been reported at the crossing. Drivers who stop their cars near the tracks often feel an invisible force pushing their vehicles forward, as if trying to move them out of harm's way. Some claim to hear the sound of children's voices on the wind, while others have seen small handprints appear on the windows of their cars. One of the most famous stories involves a woman who stopped her car near the tracks late one night. As she waited for the train to pass, she felt her car begin to move, despite the fact that it was in park. Startled, she looked around but saw no one. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something on her rear window, small, childlike handprints pressed against the glass. Panicked, she drove away as fast as she could, but the handprints remained on her car, even after she had washed it. She later learned about the legend of the haunted tracks and realized that she had encountered the spirits of the children who had died in the accident. To this day, the haunted tracks remain a popular destination for thrill seekers and ghost hunters. Many who visit the site leave with the same experience: a mysterious force pushing their car across the tracks as if trying to save them from the same fate that claimed the lives of those children so many years ago. 20. The Crying Woman of the Rio Grande. In the border town of Laredo, Texas, there is a legend that has been passed down for generations. The story of La Llorona, the Crying Woman. According to the tale, La Llorona was once a beautiful woman who lived in a small village near the Rio Grande River. She was known for her grace and beauty, but she was also known for her fiery temper. One day, she caught her husband with another woman, and, in a fit of rage, she drowned their 2 children in the river. Realizing what she had done, she was overcome with grief and threw herself into the water, where she drowned alongside her children. But death was not the end for La Llorona. Her spirit is said to haunt the banks of the Rio Grande, forever searching for her lost children. She is often seen at night, dressed in a long white gown, her face hidden by her flowing hair. Her cries of anguish can be heard echoing through the darkness, and those who hear her wails are said to be cursed with bad luck and misfortune. One chilling encounter comes from a man named Javier, who was fishing along the river late one night. As he cast his line into the water, he'd heard the sound of a woman crying in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as the cries grew louder, he realized something was wrong. Turning around, he saw a figure standing on the riverbank, a woman dressed in white, her face hidden in shadow. She was wailing, her voice filled with despair and sorrow. Javier felt a chill run down his spine as the woman slowly turned to face him. In a panic, Javier grabbed his fishing gear and fled, but the sound of her cries followed him all the way back to his car. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw her standing in the distance, her long white gown blowing in the wind. Since that night, Javier has never returned to the Rio Grande. He believes that La Llorona is still searching for her lost children, and that those who encounter her are doomed to share in her eternal grief. The Devil's Playground of West Texas. In the vast, barren stretches of West Texas, where the land seems to stretch endlessly beneath a burning sun, there's a place few dare speak of. A desolate patch of desert known as the Devil's Playground. No map marks it, and few travelers live to tell the tale of their journey there. According to legend, the Devil's Playground was once a thriving town, long before Texas became a state. Settlers flocked to the area, lured by rumors of gold hidden deep beneath the rocky soil. For a time, the town prospered, but as more and more prospectors vanished without a trace, the settlers began to whisper of something far darker than mere misfortune. A preacher, driven by a vision, arrived in the town one stormy night. He declared that the land was cursed, that it had been claimed by the devil himself. The preacher warned that the settlers had to leave immediately, or they would be trapped there forever, their souls doomed to wander the desert for eternity. But greed overruled fear, and the settlers ignored his warnings. Within a month, the entire town had disappeared, swallowed by the unforgiving desert sands. Nothing remained, no buildings, no signs of life, just an eerie silence that stretched for miles. Today, those brave or foolish enough to venture into the area tell stories of strange occurrences, footprints that appear in the sand and disappear just as quickly, disembodied voices calling their names, and figures seen just at the edge of their vision, vanishing when approached. One of the most chilling stories comes from a group of hikers who wandered too far into the desert. As night fell, they found themselves hopelessly lost, the heat of the day replaced by a bone-chilling cold. As they set up camp, they noticed strange shapes moving in the distance, shadowy figures that seemed to be watching them. That night, the hikers awoke to the sound of whispers, low and guttural, circling their camp. When they shone their flashlights into the darkness, they saw nothing until they looked down. The ground around their campsite was covered in footprints, but none of them matched their own. The prints were small, childlike, and led directly to their tents before disappearing into the desert. Panicked, they packed up and fled as fast as they could. The following morning, they were found wandering near a highway, disoriented and unable to remember how they had escaped. But all of them swore they would never return to the Devil's Playground, for they had come face to face with something not of this world. 22. The Demon of Goatman's Gulch, south of Dallas, hidden in the thick woods near the Brazos River, lies a place known to locals as Goatman's Gulch. It's a name passed down through generations, whispered among children as a warning not to wander too far into the trees. The story behind the name is far more terrifying than a simple campfire tale. In the late 1800s, the area was home to a reclusive hermit, a man known only as Old Zeke. He was rumored to practice dark magic, drawing power from the land and the creatures that lived there. The townsfolk avoided him, speaking in hushed tones of the strange lights that flickered in the woods at night and the eerie animal sounds that could be heard echoing from the gulch long after dusk. One day, Old Zeke was found dead in his cabin, his body twisted in a grotesque manner. His eyes were missing, and his skin was burned as though he had been struck by lightning, though the skies had been clear that night. After his death, a wave of misfortune swept through the town. Livestock died mysteriously, crops withered, and a sickness began to spread. Soon after, people began to report sightings of a monstrous figure lurking in the woods. It had the body of a man, but the head of a goat, with long, twisted horns and glowing yellow eyes. Some claimed it was Old Zeke, returned from the grave in the form of a demon. Those who dared to venture into Goatman's Gulch at night often returned with strange injuries, deep scratches that looked like they had been made by claws, or bruises in the shape of large hands. Others were never seen again. One summer, a group of high school students decided to camp in the gulch, hoping to disprove the legend. They laughed at the warnings of the locals, dismissing the tales as nothing more than superstition. But by morning, their laughter had turned to terror. 3 of the students vanished that night, their tents found torn open and their belongings scattered. The survivors claimed they had seen a shadowy figure moving through the trees, its eyes glowing in the darkness. They heard strange growls and the sound of hooves pounding the ground, growing closer and closer until they could feel the breath of the creature on their skin. 23. The specter of the abandoned Fort Phantom Hill. Northwest of Abilene stands the ruins of Fort Phantom Hill, a remote military post built in the 1850s to protect settlers from Native American attacks. Though it was abandoned not long after its construction, the fort's crumbling stone walls have become the site of many strange occurrences. The fort earned its name from a series of eerie encounters reported by soldiers stationed there. It was said that, at night, ghostly figures could be seen wandering the grounds, silent, pale apparitions of long-dead soldiers who had perished in the brutal heat of the West Texas sun. One particular ghost, known as the Phantom of the Hill, is said to be the spirit of a young officer who took his own life after a failed mission. His figure is often seen standing atop the hill at dusk, his ghostly form outlined against the setting sun, watching over the fort as if waiting for redemption that will never come. The fort became a popular spot for paranormal investigators in the 1970s after a group of historians camped there while documenting the ruins. That night, they heard the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves and the clank of metal, like soldiers marching in formation. When they went to investigate, they saw nothing, but the sounds continued, growing louder, as if an entire regiment was preparing for battle. One investigator, brave enough to stay the night, awoke to the sensation of someone standing over him. Opening his eyes, he saw the figure of a man in a Union Army uniform, staring down at him with hollow, unblinking eyes. The figure vanished as soon as the man screamed, but the investigator swore that he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from the spirit. Today, Fort Phantom Hill remains a place of desolation and mystery. The winds that sweep through its ruins carry whispers of the past, and many who visit feel an oppressive weight upon their shoulders, as if the souls of the soldiers who once guarded this remote outpost are still watching, still waiting for orders that will never come. 24. The Highway of the Dead, Route 666. Deep in West Texas lies a stretch of road with a reputation so dark that it was once known as Route 666, though the government, in an attempt to quell the fear, has since renamed it Highway 191. But the legends associated with this infamous road have not faded with the change in numbers. Travelers on this lonely highway have long reported bizarre and terrifying experiences. One of the most common tales is that of a mysterious black sedan, a sleek old-fashioned car that appears out of nowhere, racing toward drivers at breakneck speed. The car's headlights blind those on the road, and just when it seems like a collision is inevitable, the vehicle vanishes into thin air. Other travelers have spoken of ghostly hitchhikers, figures who stand by the side of the road in the dead of night, their faces obscured by shadows. Those brave enough to offer a ride often find their passengers vanishing from the backseat without a trace, leaving nothing but a cold, lingering chill. Perhaps the most terrifying story involves a demonic semi-truck. This massive rusted vehicle appears on the road without warning, barreling down on unsuspecting drivers. Witnesses describe it as glowing with an eerie red light, and no matter how fast they drive, the truck gains on them, its horn blaring like the wail of the damned. But when the truck is just about to ram into their vehicle, it too disappears, leaving drivers shaken and often injured by their frantic attempts to escape. One account from a trucker in the 1980s still sends shivers down the spine of those who hear it. The man, exhausted from hours on the road, was driving through the desert late one night when he saw a figure standing in the middle of the highway. Slamming on his brakes, he barely managed to avoid hitting the figure, only to realize it had disappeared. Shaken, the trucker pulled over to regain his composure. That's when he saw it, the black sedan, sitting a few hundred yards ahead, its lights off but the engine idling. The trucker turned to his radio to call for help, but before he could, the headlights of the sedan blazed to life, and the car rode toward him at an impossible speed.